Hello everybody, and thank you for being here to our online debate of the LIFE DICET project. It is our first online debate of this project, which started in September 2019 on deepening the international cooperation among emission trading systems. Today, we are going to discuss about linking emission trading system in the Paris Agreement era. And as you may imagine, this is a very important and hot topic nowadays. So we want to discuss the prospects, the opportunities, the challenges of such an important issue. Particularly important now, let's say, after Madrid and in the prospect of the future conferences. And to do that, today we have two big names, I would say. This is our Christmas presents for our audience, because I have the pleasure to have with us Delbeke and Robert Stavins. I don't think I would actually need to present them, to be honest. But in any case, for the very few who don't know them, please just 30 seconds of a short introduction with their short bios. Delbeke is a professor at the European University Institute and at Leuven in Belgium. And as you all know, he was the Director General of the DG Climate Action since its very beginning until 2018. He has a PhD in economics from Leuven, and he was, I like to call him the father, just if you allow me to give you this nickname, the father of the EU ETS. So I think he has something to say on this argument. He has been the negotiator for the European Commission at the UN FCCC conferences. He has been the negotiator and also had a key role in the implementation of the Kyoto Protocol and then in the negotiations of the Paris Agreement. On the other side of the ocean, we have Robert Stavins, and again, a name that is very familiar, I'm pretty sure, to all of you. Robert is Professor of Energy and Economic Development at the Harvard Kennedy School, Director of the Harvard Environmental Economics Program, Director of the PhD in Public Policy and Political Economy and Government, and Director of the Harvard Project on Climate Agreements. He's a Fellow of Resources for the Future, NVR, co-editor of the Review of Environmental Economics and Policy, has served in many editorial boards, as coordinating leading author of the fifth report of the IPCC, and he has published extensively on market-based policy instruments, regulatory impact analysis, policy instrument choice under uncertainty in the most famous, most important economic journals like American Economic Review, Journal of Economic Perspectives, the Quarterly, Journal of Economic Literature, and so on and so forth. I just stop here because of time constraints. So certainly we have two big guys today with us to discuss these topics. And for us, it's a great start into this project. Now, the project aims, as the name itself says, at studying how to coordinate and align the different emission trading systems, and it involves the regulators of emission trading system from Europe, China, Switzerland, New Zealand, California, and Quebec. And in the perspective of a hot topic like linking, I would like to ask them a few questions. So let me just briefly present or remind the rules of the game, so to speak. I will pose a few questions to start with, which I will ask to our two speakers. I would ask them to reply in, say, maximum 5 minutes each, giving their views on the topic. And then in the second part, we will open up to questions from the audience. So, ready, steady, go, I would say. And if you are with me, I would start with my first question to both of you, which is, what are, in your view, the implications of Article 6 for ETS linking, if any? Article 6, as we know, is really at the core of a hot debate right now. You're both back from Madrid, and you know how important this issue has been at the center of the debate. And so my first question is, what implications, if any, of Article 6? And I will start from Robert, and then we'll pass on to Jos.
Well, thank you very much, Simone. I'm delighted to be with you, both because of your own work, the institution you represent, but really most of all because it's an opportunity for me to be together with my longtime friend and collaborator, Jos Delbeke. He and I first met and worked on emissions trading systems before the EU ETS existed, and we were working on it then. We were both about 14 years old, I think, at the time. So in terms of what are the implications of Article 6 for ETS linking, my response in brief is that Article 6 is important for linking, but it's not absolutely crucial. And in order to justify that answer, let me say that there are 3 levels of action we need to consider. Level 1 is that individual countries or even subnational entities will put in place climate policies, emissions trading systems, carbon taxes, and most countries will put in place probably performance standards. And then the second level is that those various jurisdictions, those countries, can link their systems. That's really a bilateral arrangement between 2 governments. The European Union was about to do that years ago with Australia. On January 1st, it does it with Switzerland. California has done it with Quebec. So that's the linkage. That's government-government. That has nothing to do with the Paris Agreement. Even if there's no Paris Agreement, and it of course is not now actually yet having an effect, then those linkages take place and they have all the beneficial effects of lowering aggregate costs, et cetera, et cetera. Then the question comes up, the third level is the Paris Agreement does exist. Countries have taken on voluntarily responsibilities through their NDCs in the Paris Agreement. And the question comes up, when there is a linkage, and therefore there is a trade, not between 2 governments, but between 2 private sector entities, one in each governmental jurisdiction, and it could be a trade between 2 cap-and-trade systems. It could be a trade between a carbon tax and a cap-and-trade or with a performance standard. It can all be done through credits, as we have written about. Then, how is that match up in terms of determining whether or not they are achieving their NDC? So there's an accounting question. That's where Article 6, in particular Article 6.2, comes in. So without Article 6, obviously it was not completed in Madrid, without Article 6 in place, that's problematic because it is important, because it means that there will be a question of whether or not there is some double counting going on. But I wouldn't call it absolutely crucial, because linkages are going to continue to take place anyway, even without Article 6.
Please, Jos, go ahead.
Thank you very much, and let me underline that the pleasure is also from my side to work with Rob and with Simone. We have a long-standing cooperation, and it's very good to see that we can continue this also through this modern media now. I would completely concur with what Rob just said, that an agreement on Article 6 is very useful, but is not absolutely essential. Because in the ETS, the EU ETS, we have today already 34 countries as of the 1st of January 2020 that are exactly trading according to the same conditions. So Article 6 is not absolutely essential, but if we want to widen the system, I think that provisions related to Article 6 are very useful to prepare the linking on a longer-term basis between different trading constituencies. And in that sense, I think Rob indicated that the double counting issue is essential. There are also other essential elements, but the double counting issue is, without that, we can not go into a reliable system. But I would like to broaden the number of conditions we need under offsets and broaden them in a way that a number of things have to be agreed at the level of the United Nations, in particular the double counting, and I would say as much as possible. But we all know that that system is very difficult to agree with consensus on a number of detailed issues. And so what needs to be decided at the national level or at the level of linked ETSs, like in the case of the EU ETS, is very important to consider as well. And I think that the example of California is a very important one, in that sense that they had an ETS within the boundaries of California, but they allowed for a limited number of offsets, partly domestic, partly international, and they were managing that quantity in a very considered and politically astute manner. Something we did not do in the EU, because in the EU we were good pupils under the Kyoto Protocol and we accepted all CDM credits coming our way, and we saw the consequences of that. The governance around the CDM was relatively weak, to put it mildly, and the number of credits coming into the EU ETS was just massive once the United States dropped out of the Kyoto Protocol. And so we learned a little bit our lesson that we cannot have an offset system where all modalities are agreed at the UNFCCC level. There is a balance to be made at what the minimum that needs to be decided upon at the United Nations level, and the double counting is certainly the core of that. And on the other hand, a number of elements that need to be decided by the recipient countries, in this case the EU ETS, what needs to be considered as an essential element to allow credits in terms of credibility, in terms of environmental integrity, in the other elements of the governments other than just the double counting issue. So I would like to leave it there, but completely concur with what Rob said. It is useful to have an Article 6. It's not crucial because ETSs can link up with one another, and the one that we are seeing happening as of the 1st of January 2020 with Switzerland is a very important one. So we widen, another country comes in. We may lose another country, which is the UK, that is now an integrated part of the EU ETS. If the Brexit materializes, the UK is going to leave the EU ETS, but according to the discussions I had, there are good hopes to assume that the UK ETS is going to continue and is going to link in again with the EU ETS. It's a little bit of a complicated thing to do that, but that's now the reality of the Brexit that we are currently in. I stop there.
Thank you, Jos. I see that you have a common view, at least on this first point, and I suspect the fact that you've been working together since you were 14 may be a reason. But I'll try to provoke you with more questions, and probably different perspectives might arise, or similar perspectives again, given your experience. The second question I would like to ask you concerns the implications of having emission trading system with different degrees of environmental ambition for their linking. And I think this is a real important issue because we have a number of ETSs rising around the world, but also in terms of ambition with large differences. So what are the implications? What are the difficulties? I will start with Jos this time.
Okay, well, I think that the most important and difficult issue in any ETS system is defining the cap, the total amount of pollution that is allowed under the system, and how that cap is going to develop over time. And the stringency of the cap between ETSs that are going to link up should be comparable. Otherwise, you may have a quite important disequilibrium between one with a high price and one with a low price. And why would that be problematic? Because in fact, when you link up between two ETSs, the price emerging will converge. So in the constituency with a high price, when we have a full linking, that high price will go down. And in the constituency with the low price, the prices are going to go up. What we are going to see in parallel is that the amounts of allowances are going to shift around, including the payments. And I think that may be a rather difficult point to tackle. So to sum up, I think the most important element is the environmental integrity, which comes down to the cap setting. And related to the cap setting is the way we are not only defining the total amount, but also any other instruments that we may use, like the market stability reserve that we have in the EU, or the offsets that we allow into the system. That is directly or indirectly, again, making changes to the cap. So the cap setting is the most important element before two constituencies link up with their ETSs.
Thank you, Joss. Rob?
So, Simone, I hope I won't disappoint you, but I'm not going to disagree with what Joss just had to say. I think that he was right to turn the discussion from quantities to prices. That the significant factor is not so much stringency as it is marginal abatement costs. So as a result of greater stringency in one jurisdiction than another, we would typically anticipate that the jurisdiction with the greater ambition will have higher marginal costs. It'll have gone higher up the marginal cost abatement curve. However, that is not necessarily the case because it depends upon what are the technologies and the resources available to the two jurisdictions. Having said that, if there is a difference in marginal abatement costs, then Joss is completely correct, is that marginal abatement costs will converge, allowance prices will converge. Now you can view that, as Joss did, as a problem, but remember, if there's no difference in marginal abatement costs, we don't need a linkage. There's no reason for it. If they're already at the same marginal costs, then there are no gains from trade. Having said that, remember that after the linkage takes place, every one of the actual trades, which are between private firms in the two jurisdictions, are fully voluntary. In other words, both of those firms anticipate that they're better off as a result of the trade. Otherwise, they don't do the trade. So, and that's where the gains from trade are. So my answer, I guess, to your question is that having different degrees of environmental ambition is not a problem in terms of the economic efficiency of the system, but it is, as Joss pointed out, a significant factor in terms of the distributional impacts, because we're going to be having a large flow of funds essentially from one jurisdiction to the other. Again, that's not a problem in efficiency any more than international trade in general is when there's different comparative advantage, producing cement or whatever it is in two countries. But there are significant distributional issues. And let's be honest, the politicians are driven by the distributional factors, not by the efficiency factors. So if you have one jurisdiction making massive transfers of revenue under a linkage to another jurisdiction, you could picture the politicians in jurisdiction one getting upset and pressing perhaps even to sever the linkage.
And I would like to give an example of that. I think that these distributional issues can be quite important. If you look at the EU ETS, every year we have around roughly 2 billion allowances. If a quarter of those allowances managed by the companies are shifting around, say, between two constituencies, EU and China, a quarter is shifting around. That means 500 million allowances shifting around at a market price of today 20 euros. It could be in a couple of years, it could be the double of that. That is an amount of money of 10 billion euros being shifted around from the EU with high prices assuming to China with lower prices. So these distributional issues may end up in political issues because one person may say, okay, our efficiency in reaching a target is getting improved, but a net amount of money is leaving, in this example, the EU and flows to China. And given already the problems that we have when it comes to normal trade, you could complicate that debate on top of that with a distributional dispute when it comes to carbon markets. So there is a political undertone to the efficiency considerations that economists are talking about. And we call it as economists distributional issues. But if we look around today, these distributional issues immediately transpose into political problems. And that is the point I wanted to make. So Rob was clearly picking up my point. It is not a problem per se, seen from an economic viewpoint, but seen from a distributional/political viewpoint, that may be more problematic.
You both touched upon the distributional aspects, and I think that's really crucial as we see, actually, the distributional aspects have become very relevant for the climate debate lately. But just you mentioned, you took an example and said EU and China. If I can, again, try to be provocative, but let's take a real-world example, okay? Because in, 10 days, the EU-Switzerland linking agreement is becoming effective. So what do you expect this linkage to, how will it affect, let's say, the functioning of the system? For instance, what might be the effect on prices? Because I have the feeling that there is a large room for convergence there. And so in terms of price convergence, in terms of distributional aspects, what might be the effect? It is true that we are talking about very different emission trading systems, but still I would like to have your view on this.
That's a good question, and that's another political reality, so to speak, that is that the Swiss ETS is very small compared to the EU ETS, and that facilitates the linking. Roughly, the EU ETS is 2 billion allowances. I think roughly the Swiss one is around 50 million. So it's a very small kit in the wide ocean, so to speak, of the ETS, and that facilitates the problem that I just lined out. But there is another issue as well, that is that the structure of the Swiss economy is very similar to the structure of the European economy. And while I think Rob would disagree when he talked about differences in marginal abatement costs, that is the precondition to having winning benefits or positive benefits out of linking, and I would completely agree with that. When the differences are too big, the distributional consequences become too big, and the political problems may come on top of that. In the Swiss case, that's not the case. The Swiss economy is very comparable, in particular to the manufacturing sector, to the average of what the European economy is. And so I think that there is more promising linking possibilities with likewise countries in terms of economic structure, even if the economist may assume that wide differences in marginal costs of abatement are going to make the beneficial case for linking.
Maybe I should add, I agree with what Joss said, maybe I should add that although I think most economists, including myself, would picture the major benefit of linkage, one of essentially allowing marginal abatement costs to equate in the two jurisdictions and thereby lowering overall aggregate costs. And therefore, if marginal costs are identical, you don't get trading. There are other benefits of linkage. So I think they're smaller than that one, but there are other benefits. For example, there are economies of scale in terms of overhead costs. So California and Quebec are sharing essentially an auction. So, you lower those kinds of costs overall as a result of economies of scale or economies of scope. And there are also political benefits. California feels very good. California believes it's a country, not a state, and so they feel very good about being able to carry out some international linkage with Quebec, and California playing a leadership role. That's a political benefit, for the governor and for the people in the legislature in California. So there are a variety of other benefits besides the key one, which is lowering the marginal abatement costs, the lowering total costs.
I think that Rob makes a very good point in having this economies of scale. We had that a little bit in Europe as well, because at the beginning, the auctioning was very limited. But when auctioning became important, we established a European auctioning platform, but we did not oblige every member state to use that platform. And one of the member states that always had emotions about ETS, Poland, opted to have its own auctioning platform and not to participate in the European auctioning platform. And in the process of establishing their own platform, they discovered that the costs would be quite high to have an auctioning platform only for one member state. And in the end, they came around and they joined the European platform, not because they liked it, but because the costs the cost savings in terms of economics of scale were too important. And I think that's a very important element, because we sometimes forget that an emissions trading system needs a good infrastructure that is well managed, and that costs in terms of operation costs and infrastructure costs. So thanks, very good point, Rob. I think it's something we hardly talk about amongst the economists, but it is a realistic point that certainly the policymaker has to work with.
Maybe I should add one more benefit, since we're doing this now, and that has to do with price volatility. Price volatility has been an issue in some cap and trade systems. It's been an even bigger issue with critics of cap and trade systems, sometimes making it seem more important than it is. But recognize that once you expand the scope of the market by linking two systems, overall price volatility is going to be reduced, right? In one system, if some refineries get knocked out as a result of a storm, you could have price volatility, but you're expanding the market. The price volatility will be less as a result of a broader scope of the market. On the other hand, I want to acknowledge that when you link six systems together, price volatility in one of those systems automatically propagates to the other system. But I'd say overall, in terms of price volatility, linkage is good news.
Very good points.
The number of potential benefits, and we will see as I was saying, in 10 days we will see this experiment in which certainly size matters, because the EU, as Jos was underlining, the EU ETS is much larger than the Swiss one, but I think it's still a very important experiment, even because so far we just have California and Quebec, so we need to increase our experience with linking. My original question, then I asked for more, but my original question was about different degrees of ambition. Now I'd like to shift to different price containment mechanisms. And so my question is, what are the possible implications of having emission trading system with different price containment mechanisms for linking? Rob, this time.
Well, what I would start with is the simplest case, which would be a situation in which one system has a cost containment mechanism and the other system has none. Let's start with that. So an example of that would have been up until recently in the European Union, when there was no price containment mechanism per se in place. I'm talking historically now. And then California with a safety valve, a price ceiling in place. The reality is, if those two systems had linked at that point in time, then the price ceiling from the California system would automatically propagate. That precise price would propagate to the European Union, because if you could, you could always buy these allowances at the price ceiling from the California system. So you have automatic propagation of price-based containment mechanisms from one system to another. And that can be a serious concern if one system, for whatever reason, economics or politics or whatever, or environmental performance, does not want to have a price ceiling in place.
I would agree that the way we deal with prices in a direct manner is potentially problematic in view of linking, for the reasons that Rob is indicating. In fact, between the linked constituencies, prices converge. But when there is an intervention in the price mechanism, you spread over to one another the potential problem. And so apart from setting the cap, like I stressed in my opening remarks, I think that the different way of dealing with prices in a direct or rather an indirect manner is going to be a complicating factor when we look at the linking in the future. In Europe, we did not go for a price ceiling or a minimum price or a price collar, but we opted for a quantity-based mechanism, the market stability reserve, and that reserve has been translating the cap into a price containment mechanism de facto. And
Right.
And we see that the tradition in California and Quebec is completely different. That is direct price intervention compared to the Europeans who have been shying away of doing that.
Thank you. And Joss, you were giving me an assist, I would say, for a question that I want you to ask. You mentioned our European quantity-based mechanism for price containment, the market stability reserve, and I was wondering whether you personally expect that the ETS will remain the only ETS with such a system, with a quantity-based mechanism.
Oh, that's a very difficult question. I have no idea how that is going to develop in other trading constituencies over the world. In particular, the Chinese, which is the big block now entering next year into an ETS, is just about to start. So these problems may be implicitly present, but not yet explicitly present. So I haven't heard of any debate related to price interventions. However, what they are working through and struggling with, as in all setups of ETSs, that is the cap setting. Because the cap is indirectly determining the price, and it is working on the marginal cost of abatement. And when the cap is set in a tight manner, that means that the marginal cost of abatement that you are targeting are relatively high, and hence the political problems to have that cap passed. So I think it's too early to say as of now. I would also say in the European context, the market stability reserve is an instrument that is going to serve essentially for the coming decade. But after this decade comes another decade. I'm not saying that the quantity-based is there forever, but it is, of course, in legislation, and legislation is always difficult to pass over. I also observe that, for example, in Canada and the United States, they are following our experience with more than normal interest. So I would assume that even the price floors that are there now may also not be there for eternity. I think the more we work on linking, the more we should work on convergence between our different ETSs. That's the precondition for, in the end, linking. For me, linking is a long-term objective. Improving the convergence between different ETSs may be the way we have to go for first.
So Joss is certainly correct that no one can predict what the future is going to hold. But if I had to venture a guess, my guess would be is that there will be other systems that will follow the quantity-based price containment mechanism the European Union has put in place. And the reason that I say that is that if you use the price-based approach, essentially you have a hybrid system where it becomes an explicit tax, and that raises that word, tax. And there will be many jurisdictions, and China might be one of them, I can't say, that will not want to put in place, for political reasons, a system that so obviously actually has a tax at a certain point, an explicit tax. And that's going to be, I think, the big objection that some countries will have. I'm not commenting on the merits of either approach, just the political perceptions of the two approaches.
And that's certainly why in Europe, and Rob is, is pressing me to say that. That's why in Europe we worked on a quantity-based system, because we wanted at all costs to prevent that people would say, "Hey, ETS is just an instrument that is the tax through the back door." That would have been a very damaging political discussion that through the quantity-based mechanism we could avoid happening.
The three-letter word, as someone call it, the fact of talking about tax is a real problem in people's perception. I personally wonder whether, in the case of China, for instance, that starts from scratch now, this could be treated differently. Basically, it is very clear why the ETS went for a market stability reserve, and I wonder whether China could have a different, its own history in this sense, and go for a price floor, for instance. It's a provocative question, and as you said, no one has an answer for the future, and especially as economists, we are very good at going wrong with forecasts. But just to let us have your perception of what could be the way to go for China in the future.
Well, we worked a lot with China, but what I observed is that their system was very much based on the quantity approach, on the cap setting approach. They are now seeing the difficulties related to that, so they are slightly deviating. It could be relative targets and things like that. They are not yet out of the woods. That's what I see. But they started from a quantity-based approach for the reasons I think that Rob was indicating being true for China as much as for the EU.
So, China spent a substantial amount of time trying to decide between something like a cap and trade system and a carbon tax, and they made a clear decision on that. But having said that, it's important to recognize, Joss certainly knows this, but maybe not all the listeners know this, that China is not putting in place a cap and trade system. They're putting in place a tradable performance standard. And it's a multi-sectoral tradable performance standard. And it is not decided as of now whether or not there will be trading across sectors. So this is a big distance from a truly cost-effective cap and trade mechanism. Now, people that I've worked with in China and continue to work with, at one point they were indicating by 2025 the tradable performance standard system would evolve into a mass-based cap and trade system. But most recently, I was in Beijing just before I went to Madrid, and they were saying, well, 2030. So it's going off further into the future. But that's a different animal, a tradable performance standard. Finally, I'll say, in cases of interest, we actually had experience with a tradable performance standard in the United States. Our very first experience with it, with significant emissions trading, was when we phased the lead out of gasoline in the 1980s, and that was done with a tradable performance standard on the lead content of the refined product coming out of refineries.
What we learned, we followed all these exercises that are being undertaken in the world, is that getting started with the cap and trade is the most difficult point. The getting started is very enshrined in the political realities and the economic realities that are present there. So the way the Chinese are going to start is the Chinese starting point. The way we started in Europe was a fairly decentralized approach. That's why our cap crashed in the first 3 years, because we were led to believe at the central in Brussels that there was a scarcity, there was a tight cap setting. But it turned out to be a very generous cap setting that the member states did at the local level for us. So that was our way to get started. learned that the Californians started from a different angle. The Canadians started from a different angle. The New Zealanders have a different system. So I think that is where linking will take some time, because we all start different, and en cours de route we learn how to improve the system, and after a while then we look at each other's systems and we can work on convergence. But the Chinese, for example, have not yet the freedom of mind to look at convergence, because they have all their problems internally to have the cap setting machinery getting on. And that is the essence, and I think that's a very humble point of view. Getting started is damn difficult.
Yeah, it's certainly also our experience, or your experience, Jos, right? It's difficult to start, and these are delicate instruments that we need to look after as they grow. And so it's certainly true that everyone has its own starting point. And our wishful thinking is that we may observe a convergence over time, and it is actually also part of our game. I mean, part of the project and the goal of this project, the DICET project that we are developing. As you have probably understood, I would try to monopolize the discussion, because I have many questions for you. But I also have to open up to questions from the audience. So in case there are questions from the audience, please do not hesitate to ask, or better, to write, and I will then turn the questions to our speakers. In the meantime, while waiting for questions to arise, if I may, since you both mentioned Madrid, I would like to ask you, since you're back from Madrid, if you are disappointed, because let's say I was disappointed observing the results of the conference, and I think this is the general impression that many people might have had. But seeing it from inside, you might have a different view, and I would like you to tell us your view, since we're talking about the Paris Agreement area, and I'd like to know more from the backstage in a way. So, Rob first.
Okay, well, I'll be brief by saying that I urge you, if you have time, I think Jos already has, to read my blog essay or the one I had in the conversation this morning, where I lay out exactly that. The brief version is that although I was disappointed that Article 6 was not completed for all the reasons we talked about at the beginning of this discussion, Simone, I was not particularly disappointed by what has been the press focus, and perhaps your focus, I don't know, and that is the fact that there was not a statement of aspiration towards, much greater ambition in the future. If statements of aspiration of greater ambition in the future being put into a decision at a COP were sufficient to address the climate change problem, we would have addressed it 20 years ago. So statements of greater aspiration for ambition are good political statements. They please the activists, but they do nothing. They do absolutely nothing about the problem. What's important is to put meat onto the bones of the actual agreement to make it operational and effective for the ambition that already has. Then we can worry about increasing the ambition. So that's my view in a nutshell.
I would not disagree with Rob at all. I think we had no decision on Article 6, which is a pity, but the Europeans and many others always said it's better to have no deal than a bad deal. And there was a risk for a bad deal, where the double counting issue would not be sorted out, where the bringing over of too many CDM credits would drown the market from the outset, which would be an absolutely missed opportunity for the new offset instrument. So from the European perspective and from many more neutral economic observers, people thought that the real need was not there, and we could have gone the wrong track, which would have been an absolutely missed opportunity. Now, on what Rob said on the ambition level, I think I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, the ambition level was not on the agenda. It was very much alive in the street and the activists and in the European Union. But I understand when the Chinese and others, major players, the Brazilians, the South Africans say, well, hang on, this was not on the agenda. What are you talking about? We will talk about that next year in Glasgow. But the Paris Agreement foresees the tightening up of the targets in a process 2023 up until 2025. And so we should take things one by one in a well-considered and a well-prepared manner. And I hope it's a bit of a wake-up call also to the presidency of the COP and the UNFCCC Secretariat, that once a timetable and an agenda is set, you have to stick to that, and you have to prepare well in order to have good decisions. And I think that we saw this year, with perhaps the unhappy developments in Chile and elsewhere, that there was a bit of slippage in the attention that needed to be focused, because after all, we talk about difficult negotiations amongst 190 countries. So it needs to be well prepared and well orderly. And I think that is a lesson for the future.
Well, let's put it this way, if I may. We probably should have been clear with the public audience that this was not the occasion and was not on the agenda. And we should then convey more clearly what are the steps to go to increase ambition, because otherwise we run the risk that people are disappointed and we lose the momentum that we have right now.
Simone, the value of linkage is that it lowers costs and thereby facilitates greater ambition. That's actually why I'm interested. I think most of us are interested in linkage. So the discussion has gone full circle. Now Simone, I suddenly cannot hear you.
Neither can I. I do not hear you, Simone.
Yeah, I was saying that is why, in my view, it's important to convey the importance of the linkage to the public audience. Exactly what you're saying. What is linking about? Why can it be useful? And I don't think this is a technical issue, but it's something that people in the street should start understanding.
Absolutely.
So,
I absolutely agree in what you are just saying. In fact, on linking, there are two things to be done. We need to create convergence between the ETSs that are there, and we have to work on that, and that is what is happening in the Florence process, and that is, for that reason, a very welcome process. And the other element is that an offset instrument is a pragmatic way of linking. And it's not full linking, but it is implicitly connecting different trading constituencies with one another. And so the one goes with the other. And many offset schemes, like we saw in China on the CDM, prepared the ground for an ETS. And that is a very useful dynamic that we should work from. And that is why it is a pity that we could not have an agreement on Article 6, on the essentials, the backbone of Article 6 in Madrid.
I see there is one question from Susanna, who was asking if you would have any example of the main strictly legal issues connected to the ETS linkages. What could be the legal problems arising when linking?
So there are a set of legal issues. Some of those legal issues are going to be nationally within the country that is engaging in a link, and then there are legal issues under international law. Since I'm an economist, not a lawyer or legal scholar, I will just give you a reference, Susanna, and that is that Michael Melling, who is a legal scholar, Gib Metcalf, who's an economist, and myself wrote an article on linkage, which appeared in a law review, I think last year, and then a very short version was in Science Magazine. If you go to my website and you search for the name Melling, because he's the legal scholar, M-E-H L-I-N-G, you'll find this 90-page paper in which we go through it, both the economics and the legal aspects. He did all the work on the legal aspects. I did not.
If I can, that's a very useful article, by the way, and it's good to mention it. If I can give a reference from real life, I've negotiated the agreement with Switzerland, and that was a very painful and long and detailed negotiation, and it was a kind of parallel legislation that we were building up from the ETS on all possible elements. So I was myself and my colleagues as well surprised about how many issues needed to be sorted out, but the result is that we have full linking. We have full compatibility and a full immersion of the ETS in Switzerland into the EU ETS. So that's a good result, but for a lengthy and painful process. And we were a little bit surprised when we were observing how the linking occurred between Canada and California, in which the tradition of negotiation was completely different from that very lengthy and detailed tradition in Europe, which was, let's agree on a number of core issues, and there we go. That's the other way around. You have two approaches. Either you go for a complete linking of the systems, or you go for a kind of linking of the essentials, and then you amend the problems that you may encounter on cours de route.
Joss, when you write your next book, I hope that one chapter will cover that long and painful process you went through of negotiating with Switzerland. I know I would love to read it.
But the Swiss, how very detailed and meticulous they can be.
Right.
They were living up to their reputation, I would say. But the result is there. We have full linking, and I think that is a big success. But it's also making us humble in terms of linking up with other constituencies where there are different design elements related to the cap, related to price intervention mechanism, and a raft of other smaller issues.
Joss, as you see, you already have to write a new book. That's a problem because you have a lot of work in front of you already.
That's true.
And talking about your book and close friends, there is one question from Peter Wies, and actually I take the opportunity to say hello to Peter, who was asking if prices in different linked systems converge. Will it not be the case that governance needs to converge as well?
And by governance, do we assume that Peter means the supervision, the oversight of the systems?
I guess
what's meant?
That is what is meant, yes. Yeah.
So I don't know if I can answer the question, but I want to comment anyway that it's wonderful to see the name of Peter Wies, because the very first time I met Joss Delbeke in the lobby of the Maritime Hotel during a break in climate negotiations, it was Joss, Peter, and myself sitting down to talk about emissions trading systems. So it's a wonderful memory to see Peter's name. So hi, Peter, even if I can't speak with you.
Well, I think on the supervision and on the governance, the hardcore is when things go wrong. Supposedly you have a company cheating. So you have to have a legal system where the cheating can be corrected and sanctioned in the end. And that was one of the big issues with Switzerland. And it comes down to the heart of the Brexit debate, where for the Europeans, the European Court of Justice is the ultimate court that is coming in to sort out disputes or compliance checks in case there is a disagreement. And so that was a sticky point indeed, because in the end, the Swiss were asked to recognize the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, and that is not, in line with what their linking idea was. And so what we were coming forward with was a kind of special committee in case a problem is arising, that we bring a boat to our courts, and then if the problem persists, that special committee, that compliance committee, is going to sort out things. That brings, in fact, the heart of the Brexit, because in the UK, the heart of the Brexit was a rejection of the jurisdiction of the Court of Justice, the European Court of Justice. They could no longer accept that Court of Justice could have interference on British issues. And so that's going for sure going to be an element when we are going to link up, ultimately, the sooner the better, with an UK ETS, because in one of the comments that were raised, and I see them on the screen, is that one of the big reasons for the Swiss to agree and to link up to the EU ETS was liquidity. And I think that even if the UK economy is bigger than the Swiss economy, also liquidity and access to liquidity is a very important element. And I think that should not be underestimated, that there's another major benefit of linking, that liquidity is improved, and through that, volatility of prices, as Rob was indicating, is much less as it would be in separate ETSs.
So I think on the governance, there are different degrees, different elements of where it would be shared and where it would be completely separate. So I'll just take the example of, you could take California and Quebec, but it could even be California and Oregon, two different states in the U.S. If they were to link, if they both had systems and they were to link them, the California state government would have regulatory authority, as it does, in terms of compliance with California entities complying with the cap and trade system for the state of California. It would have no legal authority in terms of some entity in the state of Oregon or Quebec not complying with their program. It's a different program. They wouldn't have any jurisdiction over that. On the other hand, private entities could certainly file lawsuits. They could be in California. They could nevertheless, file a lawsuit against some firm in Oregon, but at least in the system here, and I'm sure the EU is probably a very different situation, but in the situation in the US, if we were to have linkages among states, which may arise, the actual compliance would be on a state-by-state basis, even though they might have, joint auctions or all sorts of other ways in which the top-down governance might be shared.
I see some more questions coming, but also the time passing by. So, if you don't mind, I will ask a last question that can sum up some of the elements that we've been discussing about. And the question I would like to ask you is, how could ETS linkages be facilitated, and how could we speed up the process? As Robert was saying, linking is about increasing ambition in the end. So if we want to have it and want to have it fast, how can we facilitate
Well, I think
process?
So two things occur to me in terms of what could facilitate more linkage taking place. The first thing is the necessity for more systems, more climate policies that are binding to be in place. And remember, those could be emissions trading systems, they could be carbon taxes, they could be performance standards. All of those can be productively linked. So that's the necessary condition. We need more binding, meaningful climate change policies in various national and subnational jurisdictions. In addition to that, surely the Paris Agreement, sensible rules on double counting in Article 6.2, and not nonsensible rules that actually become an impediment to linkage, will help to facilitate more linkage because it'll bring about more confidence in the market. So I think that would be helpful. And then if it's not too self-serving, I think the other thing that can help with linkage is for the three of us who are in this conversation, as well as many of the people who are monitoring the conversation, to continue to do research on linkage, the benefits, but also the challenges, and to communicate that to national and subnational entities. I think that's extremely important continuing work, and I know Joss is very involved in that, and Simone, you obviously are as well. So we should all continue.
Well, building from what Rob was saying, I think what we have created in Florence is a coming together of those who have established emission trading systems. And what we ultimately need is trust between the players who ultimately may want to link up with one another. And trust comes from good discussions and from comparing systems, from transparency about each other's systems, and that is leading to more automatic convergence. Because every time there is a review of one or the other system, you find your inspiration in the talks you had with your colleagues from based somewhere else in the world. And I think that is what we need, starting with the systems, gradual convergence, transparency, and creating trust. And ultimately, I think the linking is going to happen. And that's what we experienced with the Swiss. It was a long process when the legal details came forward, but from the outset, we had a sufficient degree of trust that was sealed through a good political agreement at the highest level saying, hey, we should do this. This makes sense because economists have outlined for us how cost containment, liquidity, volatility, it all can be sorted out by linking up. And so that trust needs to be generated, and that is the basis for more linking in the future.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you, Joss. I apologize with some of the participants because I would like to take up your questions, but we really need to close, and our team in the backstage is telling me the time is over. But I see a very good thing because I see already people discussing on the web and creating a network among themselves and exchanging views and documents, which is also part of what we like to facilitate. And I thank actually Robert for mentioning the importance of doing more research. This is actually one of the goals of our unit here, and that's why we believe it's so important. And obviously your work, Robert, and your experience, Joseph, paved the way for what we're trying to do now. And so before closing, I just want to thank you, both of you and the participants. I think it was good also to have your memories. Since we're 14, maybe a bit later, but it was great to have also your memories, because you played a big role in the linking stories, in the emission trading system stories. And since it's December 19 today, I think it's also a good occasion to close by wishing you all a very Merry Christmas. As you notice, I have a red tie, which is very in line with the period. And I would like really to thank you all, speakers, participants. I'd like to give my warmest season's greetings and wish you all a happy green 2020.